Welcome, welcome. Thank you for joining us in the Epic Movement channel on YouTube and Facebook Live. My name is Tony Wee. I served previously as a national director with the Epic Movement, and I'm here just to be able to welcome you to our channel. For those of you who are new, for you finding us for the first time, thank you for joining us. If you like what you hear from what we're doing, we are the Asian American Ministry of Cru. And if you like what you hear, please click like and subscribe, tell your friends. We will have content like this monthly, and we're really, really excited about this month's content because we are celebrating Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And of course, as doing so, we needed to make sure we had some special guests. And we always have really special guests, but perhaps I can say these are extra special guests in that we are really privileged of having some wonderful experts in the field who are being asked to do tons of things during this month. And they've so graciously actually decided to spend a little bit of time with us today. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce these wonderful people to you, and we'll start with Dr. Jane Hong, who is the Associate Professor of History at Occidental College in Los Angeles. She is the author of Opening the Gates to Asia, a Trans-Pacific History of How America Repelled Asian Exclusion. It was published at University of North Carolina in 2019. She's also been a consultant for many TV shows, including Finding Your Roots with Henry Louis Gates Jr., and appears on the PBS docuseries Asian Americans. If you haven't seen that, please go see that. It is tremendous. It is awesome. And Jane has been so wonderfully gracious to be with us today. Born in Brooklyn, raised in New Jersey, she received her PhD from history from Harvard and her BA from Yale. She was part of Cru, actually at Yale too, right, Jane? That was part of your history, so that's super fun. Shout out to Yale Cru. My brother came to Christ at Yale Cru as well, so definitely shout outs to all you guys out there. What exit did you live off of in New Jersey, Jane, if you don't mind me asking?
Oh, I lived at I lived in the northernmost part. So we're not even, it's like 18W or 18 on the turnpike. So way up there.
So you're up at the Newark side of things, right? That's
George Washington Bridge, basically.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's way up there. Okay,
like Fort Lee, basically.
Fort Lee, basically. Yeah.
Okay. Well, then we also want to welcome Dr. Daniel Lee back to the broadcast. He is the academic dean of the Center for the Asian American Theology and Ministry and assistant professor of theology and Asian American ministry at Fuller Theological Seminary. Ordained Presbyterian minister, he served in many ministry contexts, including campus ministry, chaplaincy, the immigrant church, Pan-Asian ministry, multi-ethnic churches. Is that just a fancy way to say you've done everything, Daniel? Is that it?
Well, I mean, you kind of live through different ministries, and you realize how different they are. So I think it's why it's been helpful. I listed out because I think it's helped me to understand the challenges and the benefits of different kind of ministry.
Absolutely. No, fair enough, because I think that's why you are an expert in this field as well. So Dr. Lee is the author of the book Double Particularity, with Karl Barth Contextuality and the Asian American Theology. So welcome both Dr. Hong and Dr. Lee. We are appreciative of you being here. And as part of Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, it's worthwhile to actually make sure that we parse out that tonight we're really going to be focusing in on East Asian American history, and specifically East Asian American Christian history. If many of you have been a part of our broadcasts in the previous months, we actually did a previous one on Asian American history with Dr. Lee, as well as with some of our friends from Epic, who have taken Asian American history and had that modify and enhance their discipleship. So if you haven't had a chance to see that one, that's a broadcast that is on our YouTube page, and please go check it out. But we figured that tonight would be really great to focus in on Asian American Christian history, which, to be honest with you, I've been a Christian for most of my life, and I have no idea what this is. So how does that even affect who we are and things? These are questions that I've raised in my own head, and I'm so glad that we have you guys to help parse that out. So let's just start with the question that we have in here. So with so much going on today with Asian Americans, especially with the violence that's happened with Atlanta, with racism that's been going around because of the coronavirus, and the issues that we're seeing today, how do you see Asians and Asian American Christians responding to these issues?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great place to start the conversation, because I think, it is AAPI Heritage Month this month, but Asian Americans have been in the news for the past year in a way that probably they haven't been before. There's been a lot of kind of hyper visibility of Asian Americans. And I think that's been, unfamiliar for lots of folks because, I think Asian Americans often feel pretty invisible and kind of ignored by mainstream media. I know that that's been my experience. And, I think especially in this type of anti-Asian violence, Asian American communities have been mobilizing broadly, but I don't know, for Asian American Christians, I feel like it's been confusing in lots of ways because, for Asian American Christians, they are Asian American, and many of them feel the threat. They don't always feel very safe when they're walking around outside. And like everyone else, they're watching the news and they're seeing attacks on Asian American elders in places like the Bay Area, New York City. And many of us have seen these videos of Filipino Americans being beaten up in Midtown Manhattan. And like all across the country, but Asian American Christians, so they're Asian American, they're believers, they're followers of Christ. But then, some of these issues like anti-Asian violence, in theory, they're not, these issues are just kind of safety issues. They're societal issues. But I feel like for some folks, it's been confusing because in the media, these issues have become kind of politicized and they've been made partisan, about Asian Americans is like a political issue. But so I think for followers of Christ, kind of thinking about anti-Asian violence, I think as believers, it's really about seeing your Asian American brothers and sisters, caring for them and caring for their safety. So I think this issue in many ways should be viewed as just a matter of faithful discipleship, loving your community and caring for your folks and fellow believers. But, I think for some Asian American Christians themselves, I think they're really wanting support. I know, wanting support, but not necessarily always feeling like there are those resources. And the last thing I'll say is, so it kind of raises questions about how Asian American Christians engage society, how Christians engage society, and when things are really politicized and made partisan. And then for Asian Americans, I think for, Asian American Christians, there's also differences and kind of generational differences. So I think for first generation immigrant folks, right, it's maybe a different kind of experience than for second, third, and fourth generation folks who were born in the United States and very much consider themselves American. So I think there's a lot of differences even within the Asian American community.
Yeah. So let's start out by just breaking up what we mean by Asian American, right? So I always say, like, when we say Asian American, we have to remember the fact that Asian Americans include Southeast Asian, South Asian, East Asian Americans, right? Of those heritages, we're talking about adoptees, we're talking about multiracial people. So we want to make sure we include all that when we think about Asian Americans. Even though in terms of Asian American kind of Protestantism, there's a lot more Chinese and Koreans, right? So, but overall, when we think about the Asian American context, it's a lot broader. And also, when we talk about Asian Americans, we're talking about the 170 years and more, right? Over 170 years of Asian American history. I think because there are a lot of Asian Americans, and actually in society overall, there's such a dearth of kind of awareness and erasure of Asian American history. We can tend to think the fact that, well, it's my history, it's my family history. So whenever I came, that's pretty much it. It's actually all of Asian American history. And it's basically why James pointing out the fact that there's actually like up to like fifth generation, like generations of people, right? So it's not like everybody's like, recent immigrant or second generation. I think it's really important to kind of point out. Now, so I just want to kind of point this out in terms of Asian Americans responding to this. There was a webinar kind of, at the beginning of all the anti-Asian racism happening. And it wasn't a Christian event, but there were the more older, like, Helen Zia, and there was Viet Nguyen on there and other people talking about how do they process all the racism. And it was also like college students and younger generations saying, what is happening? They have no idea what's going on. And of course, older activists are like, let me tell you what Asian American history is about. And the waves of racism that go back and forth throughout US history, right? The fact that, so then they were trying to understand what it means to be Asian American in this kind of a racialized sense. I think there are a lot of people who kind of grow up in their own families and communities, and they're like, they can say, well, I'm Chinese American, I'm Taiwanese American, I'm Korean American, but what does it mean to be Asian American and to really own that? That's like a totally different step altogether, right? And
Right.
I think this is basically where a lot of people are trying to make some sense of that.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so that's basically what I would say. Like, and trying to just make some sense of how do we think of ourselves as Asian American, especially if you come from more of a conservative background, because that racial category isn't something that they're familiar with.
Yeah. That's great. Jane, please continue.
Yeah, no, I think, and building on something that Daniel said, I think is really important. I mean, folks who study history, like historians like myself, every event that we've been doing this month, every time we are ever asked the questions about this longer history, it's, I think the answer really is that, we might be seeing a lot of this anti-Asian violence being reported in the media now, and there is an increase in the frequency and the severity of anti-Asian violence, but I mean, this is really just part of a much longer history. And, I think about events like the 1871 Chinese massacre in Los Angeles, where 17 Chinese were killed in what is now kind of present day Chinatown. So, I mean, these so violence itself is not new. And that's one thing I would want to emphasize, because, I would hate for folks to think that all of a sudden racism began or anti-Asian violence began in 2020, when, it really just follows in a much longer history.
Right. Well, at the very least within the Christian, or at least the evangelical setting, with that there's an awakening of like, hey, there's issues that are actually occurring and this violence really is happening. Because I mean, to your point earlier, Jane, that both sides of the aisle, it feels like when I think about my family, that are on one side versus the other side, they're both talking about Asian American violence. They're both saying, I don't want to go to Midtown Manhattan because of what could occur in that space, whether they're left or right. So yeah, it's hard when they become partisan, but yet can't this just become a human situation that we need to really discuss and talk about? And yeah, I love how you guys are linking it, that this isn't new. This isn't a new thing. We're just actually heightened by it, because of what's going on today. And as we think about this, because this is the fascinating piece, is why is the church the way that it is really the biggest question, right? So how can you give us some milestones or some key moments in the Asian American church history, and how has that shaped kind of this confusion or this response to these types of issues today? Or how has that shaped the Asian American church?
I mean, I can sketch a few kind of broader points about the context. I mean, I think what we need to understand is that for most of American history, so up until about the 1960s, until the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, which is one of the laws that I study in my research, up until the 1960s, early 1970s, there weren't that many Asian Americans in the United States. And that was because US immigration and naturalization laws generally barred Asians. So for most of American history, Asians they were racially barred from entering the United States for long-term settlement. So visitors could come in, you had kind of diplomats, students could kind of come for a few years and leave. But long-term permanent settlement was basically cut off. Asians were cut off by the 1930s. And those laws were gradually repealed, during World War II and the early Cold War. By the 1960s, those restrictions were lifted. But again, for most of the period before that, beginning with Chinese exclusion in the 1880s, you really just begin to see this period where Asians can't really enter the United States in large numbers. And the other really important piece of that story is, people born, so Asians, people of Asian descent, were also barred from becoming US citizens until 1952. And that's a really important part of the history. So even for those immigrants who were able to enter the United States, who were able to gain entry, they couldn't actually become citizens. They couldn't vote. And there are many other parts of citizenship that they couldn't exercise. And so, so that longer history, that kind of history really in many ways, I would argue, kind of, it sets the stage in many ways for how many Americans viewed Asians in the United States as kind of maybe less American, somehow kind of foreign. So there's a kind of longer history, a legal history that underwrites or kind of influences some of those ideas. So, because the Asian American community was pretty small, artificially kept quite small, you're talking here about, less than 1% of the US population before the 1960s, mostly Japanese Americans. The largest group by far were Japanese Americans, and then Chinese Americans were the second largest. And, the thing about it is Japanese and Chinese Americans had their own really thriving churches. Many of them had early relationships with US missionaries, and other church denominations, Presbyterians, Methodists, and others. And so what you see is a really thriving, Japanese American churches after World War II, really into the 60s. I mean, these churches begin early. So by the time, the 1960s, 1965 is really this kind of turning point in Asian American history. And it's a turning point in Asian American Christian history too, right? Just because the number of Asian Americans who live in the country dramatically increases because of new immigration. And as Daniel suggested earlier, Asian America becomes a lot more diverse. It's no longer just Japanese and Chinese Americans. Now you have folks coming in, like my parents came from South Korea in the 1970s. My mom was a nurse. That's how she gained entry. And you also have folks coming from South Asia, right? Large numbers, and Southeast Asia, not just after 1965, but also after the Vietnam Wars, right? So the refugee migrations of the 70s and 1980s. And so that also changes Asian American Christianity, because you have, different ethnic groups speaking many different languages, many different generations now, forming their own, in some cases, forming their own denominations and churches. In other cases, joining, majority culture, denominations and churches, in ways that really I would argue, kind of reshape Asian American Christianity, and in turn, American Christianity.
And this is where I think, even with the small numbers, I think the question is, how do we kind of have a historical awareness of Asian American Christianity in its historical depth? So we talk about, and James really helpfully kind of divided the historical context from the pre and post 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act. And what's interesting is the generations that were there, the Japanese Americans who lived through kind of the Japanese American incarceration during World War II and came out of it. And you see these Japanese Americans and also Chinese Americans, as they mature and as they live through the formation of Asian America, right? Because before 1968, around that time, there was no such thing as Asian America. Like, every ethnicity was separate. But what ends up happening is, with the Third World Liberation Front and the activism that happens, and then of course out of that comes all the ethnic studies, you basically end up having this kind of pan-ethnic political coalition called Asian American identity, right?
Right.
And along with that, the Japanese Americans, people like Roy Sano and Paul Nagano and all these other Asian American leaders at the time, who were basically, this is like almost before evangelical movement, right? They start thinking about themselves as Asian American as well. And I think that's really interesting to recover that history, because I see some of that happening now, right? So around that time, and this is one of the things I've kind of thought about a lot. Why was it the fact that these people of that generation, around late 60s and 70s, kind of have an awareness of their racial identity and become a lot more kind of activists in terms of how they think about their Asian American Christianity, right? And of course, something like that is happening now. I see a lot of Asian Americans, and the parallel is this: you have around that time, second and third generation coming of age and realizing, wait a minute, I'm not really like an immigrant. I'm an American, but I'm not treated like an American. So what does that mean, right? So that's happening. Of course, that's what's happening right now, because all the post-1965 immigration, that cohort, you have a lot of second and third generation developing as well. So there's the maturing of generations. A second thing is the fact that you have people who are, there was actually incidences of anti-Asian racism. Back then, it was a Vietnam War. You turn on TV, it's televised. Like, people are killing Asian people. And people are like, oh my gosh. And of course, Asian Americans are being drafted to go kill Asians. So they're like, what does this mean? So they're trying to process that. And of course, right now, all this stuff is happening in terms of racism, right, against Asian Americans. And then you have, back then, it was actually Black power. There's actually Black activism. And Asian Americans are like, what does this mean for us if Black folks are activists and promoting their own sense of identity? What does it mean for Asian Americans? So there's an interaction there. And of course, a lot of Asian Americans in this present time is looking to Black Lives Matter and saying, what does that mean for us if that's happening? And we're trying to make some sense of that. I mean, even if you're politically not super supportive of all that, you're like, there's something happening here that we're trying to contend with. And of course, that's Asian Americans doing that. And of course, in general, during that time, counterculture was becoming almost mainstream. And of course, all the activism that's happening, being woke, has become becoming mainstream, or it's becoming entering mainstream consciousness. So when you see that happening, there's actually kind of an awakening and saying, what does it mean for us as Asian Americans to be Christian? And I see this happening generationally, this kind of echo. And it's one of the reasons why this is happening as a whole kind of a group, Asian Americans as a whole, kind of, post 1965, later generations, Asian Americans. And then the church is trying to figure out, okay, what does that mean for us now? Right? Because they're part of this whole kind of group awakening as well.
And it feels like and you've mentioned this in previous broadcasts, Dr. Lee, that the way that the church is interacting is almost, a generation behind the conversations that are occurring with these folks too. So they're always trying to play catch up to this conversation, and they can never really necessarily engage it in a thorough way because maybe it's separated, from their consciousness, right? They're still trying to figure that out.
Generally, right, the church is kind of like a decade behind everything in society, right? Just always trying to catch up and trying to figure out what's. I think sometimes we're catching up because we don't. I think we don't realize the fact that sometimes God is working in the world as well, right? It's not almost like, okay, the church is always. I think sometimes church has an antagonistic relationship with the world without realizing the fact that sometimes God does work in the world. It's not like everything in the world is all demonic and terrible. Right. So when we finally realize, oh, that actually might be something good because we've been fighting it for so long, then we end up being far behind. Other times, I think our theology has to catch up, and that just takes a long time to kind of just make some sense of what's happening.
Well, I think, though, I want to use this as a segue into the next question, because what I'm so fascinated by is, again, what are the theological influences that have shaped, I would say Asian churches in America, but also Asian American churches when we think about that? Because, again, there's something that we decided to focus on instead of maybe some of this other things that we're talking about. Hey, how do we wrestle with these cultural dynamics that are actually occurring? We chose theologically to focus on something else. Can you tell us about some of those influences?
I thought about this, and I was thinking about how, for example, like historical Black colleges and universities, right? I mean, when you have those kind of institutions, and you have like Black seminaries, like have over at like Howard and other places, they actually are able to think about theological issues from a Black perspective. Now, what is that from an Asian American perspective, right? Where do you get like an Asian American centric way of thinking about the world? Well, we don't have that. And actually, a lot of the schools, they actually don't have Asian American studies. And even like some of the top like Ivy League schools, they don't actually have a really developed Asian American studies. And the question is, what would you do when you can be really, really well educated, but really have very little understanding of Asian American studies? So, and that happens, I think, with seminaries as well, where where a lot of, at least churches in this time, are influenced by just evangelical seminary education. And that doesn't give us tools to think about culture, race, or just in terms of how do we make sense of these issues. And that's, so we kind of, I guess, follow whatever the categories that evangelical seminaries have given us, and then that kind of that ends up kind of guiding our experience. And the problem is, there's definitely things that we've learned that is beneficial. It's not just, it's beneficial to everybody in America, but there's actually a lot of things that either distort our experience because it doesn't really help us, like the tools that are given, or we just don't have tools to make sense of our experience, right? It's not beneficial. So I think that's part of the problem. Like, we're part of this kind of broader, if you can say, kind of white normative, like evangelical education. And like I said, a lot of them are beneficial. I grew up with Tim Keller and John Piper. I don't think it's bad. It's just that there's certain things it covers, and a lot of things it just does not. And so what do you do with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, thinking back to some of the folks that Daniel mentioned from the 1960s, 1970s, some of these Asian American and particularly Japanese American church leaders who were really active, and, they were really thinking about questions like, what does it mean that God created me as a Japanese American or an Asian American? Like, what does that mean? And, because I think believers, Christians, believe that God's very intentional. Like, God doesn't do anything by accident, right? He creates people purposefully. And, so folks in the 60s and even before, but particularly in the 60s and 70s, were asking, like, what does it mean? And I think several of those folks, as Daniel also mentioned, had experienced wartime incarceration during World War II. And so for them, they couldn't, they didn't there was no way to kind of erase their ethnic and racial identity because it had formed their community, it had formed their church. And, obviously they were operating within majority culture, right? Because they were Japanese American and they had been born in the United States. But, their government had also incarcerated them for several years, and they experienced a lot of violence and discrimination because of their because of how they looked and because of people's assumptions about them. And so I think, you see people asking questions that people are still asking today, right? It's like, what does it mean then? Like, why does being Japanese, Korean, Asian American, right? What does that mean for how we understand the Bible? What does it mean for what discipleship could look like? Because I think, in many ways, ignoring, ethnic particularity, racial identity doesn't really, in many ways, it doesn't do justice to the very unique and creative ways, right, that God has made us. And so I think, you have different periods of time when people ask similar questions. They might come up with different kinds of answers, but I definitely think that these are still live questions. And even with the creation of Epic, right, it's thinking about, Epic movement was created because, Cru, leaders of Cru and folks, Christians, they understood that there is something different. There is something unique and special that God created, when God created Asian Americans. And so if you really want to serve your brothers and sisters who are of Asian descent, like, how do you reach them? How do you speak to them? How do you encourage them? And how does identity, ethnic and racial identity, play into that conversation? Like, I think these are just very, I don't see them as, I think oftentimes these questions get politicized too, as I was suggesting earlier, but in lots of ways, I think it's just,
it's just people's lived experiences, right?
It's just, it's just kind of, it's lived theology. It's like, how do you actually live your faith out in practice?
Yeah. Well, Dr. Hong, you brought up something really interesting. Is there's the wrestling with of the Japanese church pre-1965, right? And I used to go to Evergreen San Gabriel Valley, actually. So shout out to the old school Corey Ishida, Reverend Ishida. Thanks for all you do. And just how much that there needed to be like wrestling with an identity. But then when Dr. Lee, you talk about even the churches post 1965, it was more formed from, say, typical evangelicalism. And I remember talking to a friend even last night. We were discussing how, when the way we do our hermeneutics or the way we do our exegesis, if we don't kind of think that when majority culture doesn't always feel like they have an ethnicity, and then they put that onto how they do the Bible, it colors or it removes a layer of that ability to understand the Bible, right? Whereas, when you are continuously aware that you're different, in the same way that, say, Greek believers versus Jewish believers, right? Hellenistic Jews versus Hebraic Jews, they understood that there's cultural differences and that colors how they understand the relationship with God. I mean,
yeah, and think about this. Like, so I was talking to a friend of mine this morning and saying, we're talking about this discussion, saying, do people know the fact that resurrected Jesus is still Jewish? How weird is that, right? We think, but isn't the resurrected body glorified body? I'm like, well, but why do you think the glorified body is like stripped of its particularities? Like, there's no such thing as a generic human being. It just doesn't exist, right? So, and Jesus' Jewishness, as you know, really matters a lot. So when we're united to Christ, we're united to a Jewish Jesus. And that basically means that if that's particular, if Jesus is particular, we are particular too. So if we think about that, that's really bizarre in one sense, but it makes perfect sense because we believe in the resurrection of the body. We believe, and of course, not random body. I joke around with that. I think I'm not sure if I shared this before. I joke around about the fact that when I resurrect, I'll resurrect with my Korean American, Asian American features. Yeah. And people are like, really? But wouldn't I be stripped of this? I'm like, why would you be stripped of that? Because then who would you be, right?
Right.
And of course, if Jesus wasn't Jewish, I mean, can you imagine the disciples be like, who are you? Like, if some totally random person, right? Some like Nordic, like Swiss-looking Jesus would be like, what happened to Jesus? But that's not what's happening, right? So I think this is where we have a disconnect because we don't realize that all that human particulars that Jane's talking about as well, that all those particulars actually are so essential to the Bible. And of course, it shouldn't be used to, like separate people and all this different stuff. But those particulars are seen by God. And they're part of our salvation. It's part of who we are, right, as people. And of course, those things have to be reconciled as well with the gospel.
Right. And I try to always challenge people with Revelation 7. When you see that picture of every tribe, tongue, and nation, right, I always ask people, well, what language are they singing in? Are they singing American? Or maybe they're all singing Kirk Franklin or Chris Tomlin. Is that how it goes? No, there's particularity in our expression of how, and there's something beautiful about the cacophony of people groups being able to worship in their own tongue and language in the way that they do that, so same thing. There's a need for particularity because we all represent the character of God in our unique ways. So.
And I should have pointed out, so when Revelation talks about this, people talk about, nations, people, tribe, and tongues. I think some people like to say, look, that's talking about really ethnicity and not about race. And I'm like, look, I don't think you realize the fact that the human particularity has multiple features, and Revelation is talking about something like metaphorical, because it's obviously not talking about nation states, because nation states keep on changing over time. Like, where was America, right? America didn't exist a couple of hundred years ago, and there's like a whole new nation. So I think some people would like to think, well, what do you do with all the multiracial people? I mean, if you're talking about ethnicities, it's not talking about the divisions of different people. It's talking about human particularity that really matters, which is like a slightly different way of thinking about it, right? So that's basically why racial features matter. Because if you think about Black Americans, they're not Africans anymore, like living in America. They're Black Americans. It's like a racial experience, right? I think it's really important to understand that. Otherwise, I think a lot of people will say, well, ethnicity I'm comfortable with, but race I'm not. I'm like, well, they're all part of our experience. You can't separate those things. I mean, they're important in different ways, but they're all part of our experience.
Right.
Yeah, and I think these debates over identity, and particularly within the U.S. church, I think we also have to contextualize them back into kind of broader U.S. Christian history. Because, another piece that I think we might have alluded to earlier, but that really, merits further just kind of fleshing out just a little bit, is, in the 60s and 70s, you have this kind of huge shift from mainline Christian, right, dominance. Like, so mainline churches, like the United Methodist Church, Presbyterian Church, right? These are kind of the more dominant Christian denominations. But then in the 60s and 70s, evangelical denominations become much more powerful, and more people, and not just kind of majority culture folks, but Asian Americans as well, begin shifting from kind of mainline denominations and organizations to evangelical organizations and denominations. And so, different denominations and different kind of Christian organizations, they have kind of different approaches to identity, and also different approaches to societal engagement. Like, what is the church's role? Should it engage in these broader societal issues? Should it not? What should this engagement look like? Should it engage in partisan politics, right? These are real things, right? That church denominations and organizations made decisions about, and that really forms the context in which these debates were taking place. So it's not just like identity as divorced from just what's happening on the ground, but it's always in the context of these institutions and organizations that these debates were taking place. And that's important to remember.
No, that's really great, Dr. Hong, because we're thinking about it in terms of how the institution has affected our theology, and ultimately that shapes what we do care about. I mean, so today is a really complicated world. Then, how do we really engage in this, as we're doing this broadcast? It's about discipleship. It's about, as we are building, multiplying disciples within the Epic movement and also within Cru, how do we disciple Asian American young people, collegiates in today's day? It feels like this is so complicated with this. How would you guys help us disciple Asian Americans?
I mean, I think about what's the goal of discipleship? We want full transformation, every aspect of who we are under the lordship of Christ. That's really what we really want. We want all of who we are to be used for God's kingdom. I think that's basically what I think about. When I was in campus ministry, I would talk about how do we get people to be fully transformed, right, in every aspect of who they are. I think the issue is that there's so many aspects of ourselves that we actually have no way of articulating. It's almost like I don't know what to do with. Or I think another analogy I've used with a lot of our students is that there are a lot of ourselves that we want to abandon. It's like, when I was growing up, it was almost as though being Asian American was this baggage. And I was like, well, just because I want to leave it, it doesn't mean it's being left behind.
Right.
So how do I transform and heal, transform and use that for God's kingdom? One of the examples that I kind of use is I see people who are amazing Asian American culture makers. People like Viet Nguyen, or people like David Chang, who's a chef. I mean, just doing amazing things that it really impact American culture. And they see, it's almost like they're working with all of their cylinders running, right? They actually are using all of who they are. And then I see a lot of Asian American, Christians. They're like, well, I don't want this side of myself. I don't want this. So it's almost like they're running on like half the cylinders. And I'm like, wait a minute. You're not going to be, there's no way you can be as creative, as generative to contribute to the world and to that kind of ministry if you're abandoning such a huge part of who you are because you think it's all baggage. So I think that's part of it. And that's basically why I really emphasize knowing, I think the importance of like Asian American studies and Asian American history, Asian American psychology, especially for college students. If they go to a college that actually have those programs, I'm like, definitely make use of those things. Now, every kind of study, you have to think about it critically, but I think the question is, how do you mix and have names to identify different parts of yourself so that you can kind of bring that for God's kingdom? And it's such a big part of, I think, our discipleship, to be able to kind of fully be transformed, fully be submitted to Christ, fully be used for whatever God's kingdom, work that God's calling us for.
I like it. Yeah.
And I would, build on a number of those points. And the first one is just, to value for Asian American folks, like God made you Asian American on purpose, right? So in some ways, to not embrace that about yourself is to deny the very unique way that God created you. And that's a hard thing to do. I understand. Like I grew up Korean American, Asian American on the East Coast. And, I grew up with folks who, I grew up hearing racial slurs, people like calling me things like in public at the mall, making kind of like gestures with their eyes. I mean, when you're young and you're exposed to that and people are making fun of you, putting you down, calling you things, like it's hard to love yourself and to not feel like any self-hatred, right? And I think a lot of folks who grow up, a lot of Asian American folks, like that's a struggle that I think many of us experience. And particularly for young people now, right? During this particular moment, like it's hard to understand, like, why do people hate me? Why do people hate my family, right? So as believers, valuing yourself because God values you like that, even if other people don't value you, even if you feel invisible sometimes, understanding that, you are valuable because God declared you to be. So I think there's that kind of starting point. And I think, as Daniel suggested, part of understanding, part of valuing yourself is kind of valuing your own history and being able to articulate kind of where you came from. I mean, I'm a U.S. historian. I don't teach Asian American history specifically at my institution. I teach U.S. history classes. But Asian American history is part of U.S. It is U.S. history. So China exclusion, Japanese American incarceration, all these kind of moments, these are part of U.S. history. And I teach them regularly as part of, because they are part of this nation's history. And so, I mean, this is a general message, not just to Asian American folks, but to all, I think people who consider themselves American. I mean, in order to really understand who you are and where you fit into society, into our current moment, you need at least a basic grasp of history, you don't have to read 100 history books. No one's saying that, but just like getting like the lay of the land.
Yeah.
You really understand, right, where we are now without understanding where we came from. So whether it means, watching documentaries, just reading some books, right, reading a lot, historical literacy, especially for Americans, is so important because I think U.S. history, the United States has been so incredibly powerful in the world, especially since War II. And so U.S. history, in many ways, recent U.S. history is not just national. It's like really, in many ways, it shapes, right, the international and the global, has had major impact on big parts of the world. So I think for Americans generally, I think that's important to know. And then for Asian Americans specifically, I mean, I really just, and again, I'm speaking to myself, I'm speaking to my own daughter. I'm trying to tell her this like a bajillion times as she grows up. It's other folks might minimize you and they might call you names and they might, discriminate against you, but the value you have comes from the value that God gave you. And I think that is something that no one can take away from you. And so I would really hope that folks could hear that.
Yeah, if I can add just a little bit, along with that, And I think Jane would agree with the sense that loving yourself and all this different stuff doesn't mean some stereotypical, like, oh, you gotta love all Asian stuff. It doesn't mean that, right? So I think the more representation you have, you're like, oh, there's so many different ways of being Asian American, right? Because that's part of the problem, I think. We think, oh, affirming Asian American means I'm going to be some stereotypical Asian American. No, it doesn't mean that at all. You can actually, but you have to acknowledge it, right? And make some sense of it and kind of attend to it. It doesn't mean like, oh, you got to now, I don't know, eat Chinese food all day. Whatever, some stereotypical thing that we hear, right? It doesn't mean that. I think it's a wide variety, but that's part of the problem as well. Like if you only take like tiny little stereotypical representations, you're like, well, that must be what being Asian American means. I must speak my, language, who I marry, what language. It doesn't really mean that, right? How do you kind of understand yourself in a broader sense? Like I always joke around about the fact that, because people think, because I run an Asian American center, and people think, oh, you must want me to, I would tell people like, I'm not your mother or your grandmother. I don't say, what language are you speaking? Look at the mirror, which is what my mom used to say. Look at the mirror. You will be Korean until you die. I'm like, no, that's not what I'm talking about, right? There's so many different ways of being, I think, Asian American, but still affirming and making sense of that. And I think it's really, really important to understand that.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. And I think you're exactly right. Like, and this is maybe a mess, and this is maybe just a thought that, just, again, is for everyone. I mean, I think on the one hand, all of us have different identities, like whether or not you recognize that you have different identities, like even if you're not Asian American, you have an ethnic identity, you have a racial identity, you're a father, you're a mother. I mean, there are all these different roles and identities that you have. We're also all Christians, right? And that's a very important identity that we all have. So, I mean, on the one hand, understanding that and kind of, embracing it, but not allowing it to become like a constraint that forces you to live up to some stereotype or caricature, because that's not the point either. Because I don't think that's, because at the end of the day, we're all human, right? And I think, what we can do as believers is just kind of ascribe other people their humanity, their full humanity. And their full humanity, right? Full humanity means, yes, Daniel, you are Korean American, you are Asian American, you are male, your father, all these things, but you are also human, right? There's a lot of parts to you. And so I can't just boil everything down to you're Korean American, you're Asian American, because that's also not the point. You know what I mean?
Right.
And how do you let all the different people? And how do you let all the different identities become transformed in Christ? What does it mean for all of that to be included in Christ? It's not like I leave some of those behind, right? So it's not like I leave my Korean Americans behind or Asian Americans behind or my fatherhood behind or my sons. All that has to be in Christ. I think that's the point that we're trying to make, I think,
Right. And it's not even about the hierarchy is like, oh, it's all about the identity in Christ, so therefore everything else is not important, right? It's got to be some totality that everything is under the umbrella of Christ, but they're all needing to be considered, and they're all needing to be part of who we really are as our identity as a whole, right? And that's what we're talking about, is making holistic disciples. So you both are actually just making me really emotional, because it's just, there's so much within that's like speaking and yelling, this is who you are, this is who God made you to be. And we want you to live that and be that as a disciple of Christ. We want you to live yourself out to the fullest, because that's who God made you, and to submit all of this into the eyes of Christ. So, man, I could talk forever with that. And I just love hearing both of you speak into that, but we are running out of time. So maybe you guys can give one resource each that you could recommend for people to take a look at if they want to enter into this journey, or how to engage Asian American history. And especially, let me target this for our non-Asian crowd, saying, if you're wanting to be a disciple of Christ, how do you engage Asian American church history and history?
I mean, there's definitely one resource I could recommend to folks. For folks who like podcasts, for example, right? The Fuller Asian American program has a podcast called Centering. And this last season, season 5, a church historian named Tim Sang and I co-hosted a whole season where we did all these episodes on Asian American Christian history, where we interviewed folks. We talked about different kind of aspects of Asian American Christian history, so Filipino Americans, right? Different groups and different individuals across history, people including Roy Sano, who Daniel mentioned earlier. And so you just get, snapshots of history in these kind of bite-sized, right, podcast episodes. So I'd really recommend maybe checking that out because it's a really accessible way to tap into that history.
Yeah.
I know she stole yours, right?
Jane and Tim did an amazing job. I mean, really, and I think it's really great. And every episode is so insightful. I'm gonna basically recommend a book that I use for my core Asian American identity ministry class. And it's actually not a Christian book. It's Asian American Psychology. It's called Asian American Psychology: Current Perspectives, edited by Nita Tawari and Alvin Alvarez. The reason why I use that is because Asian American identity is so complicated. It's hard to find one book. So I usually assign that book and just say, look, you don't have to read because it's for therapists, right? But it's hard to find one book that covers a huge range of experiences. So I recommend that. And now it's just so that you can kind of give some background into history, and everything's all like little chapters, right? So that's basically what I use for my students. And a lot of my students, they have like almost no background in Asian American studies, right? So they come in and they go from like zero to hopefully college graduate level, right? And I have to get them there really fast. And this is one of the texts that I use. So then a lot of ministry people, I recommend this because, like I said, unless they want to read like 10 books, which is very tough and difficult to do, they can kind of just go through different sections here and pick different interesting, topics for them.
That's great. That's great. Well, we're about at the end of our time. Can you let the folks know what you guys are up to for Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, or things that we can find you at, just so we can support you and the things that you guys are doing right now?
So if you the Fuller Seminary's Asian American Center, or the long name is Center for Asian American Theology and Ministry, we had a number of events we always do. We have chapel. So if you want to see what API a chapel looks like, how would you do a service? I mean, we actually do something like that, right? So if you go to our website, if you go to or if you follow us on Facebook, we have all these things that we promote, or you can follow me on my Facebook page, right? Because I'll share this on a regular basis. And I think there's somebody who can kind of share that just in terms of like what my Facebook looks like. A lot of people follow me on Facebook because I just share all this stuff on a regular basis. You do. And
it's like a constant stream. I can't keep up a lot, but it's great.
So you can kind of see what that looks like. But that's part of what we do on a regular basis. We trained a lot of Asian American ministry leaders, because the question is, how do you connect this to ministries? So that's what we're interested in. And so you can reach out to me. You can reach out to the Asian American Center, and I can talk to you directly and just kind of Zoom with you in terms of what you think about these things. And I do that pretty regularly, just have random cold calls and saying, okay, well, let's talk about what's happening and how we can support you. So feel free to reach out.
Dr. Hong, how about yourself? How can we find you?
Well, this month on PBS, and I think on Amazon as well, the PBS docuseries Asian Americans, just 5 episodes, is streaming for free. You can see me in episodes 2 and 3. And in episode 3, you can actually see my wedding photo and photos of my mom. There's a whole section near the end about my family's immigration experience, part of episode 3. And also, please follow me on Twitter. So there's a number of scholars who study Asian immigration, Asian American communities, who are very active on Twitter. And there's lots of events. So I regularly tweet about Asian American history and about the different events in which I'm participating. And I also have, links to other scholars as well. So I would really encourage folks, if you're interested, social media, if you're on it anyway. It's actually Twitter is actually a great way that even I've learned a lot about Asian American history and U.S. history more generally. So I would encourage you to check those out.
That's a good way to redeem Twitter for its usage. Then it's to actually learn Asian American history, instead of blasting people. That'll be good. Let me make sure that we say that the Asian American docuseries is an excellent resource for you to take a look at. Of course, we want you all to check out epicmovement.com. We have new material on there for an Asian American race Bible study, as well as just general good discipleship material and evangelism tools for those of you who want to express their faith. I do want to give another shout out, Dr. Hong. You're actually featured in another docuseries that's near and dear to me because it's a friend of mine. Baldwin Chu has a new docuseries on PBS called Far East Deep South. If you have a chance to check that out on PBS, that'd be terrific. He's a Christian, and he shares about his roots. So if you to learn a lot about the Chinese Exclusion Act, but then finding his family in deep South Mississippi, and so completely amazing, wonderful story. Yeah, it's just part of that faith story that's where you're learning yourself and finding more of yourself in that. So, well, we are out of time, but thank you so much, Dr. Hong, Dr. Lee, for being a part of this. We know that our audience is just really grateful for your contributions to the kingdom, and we're really hoping that we can actually help our young people grow more in their faith and understand that their Asian Americanness is not a mistake. It's a part of who God made them, and it can be part of how they transform the world moving forward. So we're grateful for you guys. And again, if you're in this channel and you like what you see, please click like, subscribe. We'd love to for you to share this with others. And we want other people to have resources. Oh, and by the way, there is a list of resources that are going to be posted on the page that both Dr. Lee and Dr. Hong recommend. So we'll have that for you guys as well. But until next time, everybody, thank you so much for being here. And Dr. Hong, Dr. Lee, we really appreciate you both. So take care, everybody.
Thank you. Pleasure being here.